Hi everybody, it's Stephen D. Today, talking about the NFL protests regarding the national anthem brought on by our president's tweets to demand that anybody who protested during the national anthem should be fired, and that if there were protests, fans should boycott the NFL. I might have a little different take on it than most people, though. The standard reaction from many people, certainly many people on the right, is that you're disrespecting the flag and the anthem and all this. When you do that, you're disrespecting our troops who fought for our freedoms, who defend our freedoms. Freedom of speech apparently doesn't mean very much to these people because they all want us to be standing up like a bunch of faithful Hitler youth, and instead of doing the swastika salute, we're supposed to put our hand over our heart or salute or do something to indicate that we're being patriotic and in line with our government and our military. And the question is, for me, is when has our military ever really fought wars to defend our freedoms? Not very often. Let's look at it historically. Okay, let's go this war by war. Okay, the Revolutionary War. Soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War were fighting for independence from Great Britain. But were they fighting for the freedoms of that were in the Bill of Rights? No, the Bill of Rights hadn't been created yet. Most of them were fighting, for the rights and privileges of a select group of people, white males, and particularly white males with property. So, yeah, we had a Declaration of Independence, had some nice words in it about freedom and equality and all that, liberty, justice. But the reality is that even the Revolutionary War, which created independence from Great Britain, we stopped being a colony, was fought not to, defend our freedoms, because in effect, it really didn't help anybody who wasn't, like I said, a white male who, was upset with being ruled by England. And you have to remember there were a significant number of people who were loyal to the crown. So, their freedoms, most of them got run out of the country. They lost their freedom. They lost their freedom to stay in the country after it became a country. They lost their homes, their livelihoods. But I will give you this. It did provide, some measure of, liberty for some people. And when the federal government in 1789 came up with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, we put some of those freedoms, at least for some people, not anybody who was a slave, for example, but other people, white males, in our Constitution as rights, that the government could not prohibit our free speech. They could not, without justification and a warrant, come in and raid our homes and drum up charges to put us in jail. They couldn't seize us and put us in jail without, like I said, due process. That's the basic part of the Bill of Rights. So what's the next big war we get involved in? And I'm not talking about minor conflicts like our fights with the Barbary Pirates or whatever. Next big war is the War of 1812. This was a war that was basically a conflict between Great Britain and the United States. We were complaining about them impressing U.S. sailors. There was also some economic issues involved. I'm not going to go through the whole detail, but that was a war of self-defense to a large extent. Britain tried to invade the United States and did invade the United States up north, where they were fought around upper New York or Maine, somewhere like that. Also, the famous battles and invasion of the capital area and Baltimore. That's where the anthem came from. So that was a battle for self-defense, and so one could argue that it was a battle for our freedoms, a war for our freedoms. What about our other wars during that period, however? Well, they were mostly wars against Native Americans. There were a slew of conflicts by Americans against Native Americans, and they weren't defending our freedom. They were actually stealing land and taking freedoms away from Native Americans so that, white males primarily could benefit. Then there was the Mexican War. Remember that one? War that we, trumped up and started for no reason other than to grab territory. And if you don't believe me, just go check out a history of the Mexican War. Abraham Lincoln protested that war as a congressman. He said it was beyond the powers of the government. It was not a war to defend anybody's freedoms. It was a war to steal territory from the government of Mexico. So then we come to the Civil War, or as some in the South like to call it, the War of Northern Aggression, or some people like to call it the War between the States, what have you. I think here's one of the few examples where you could say that the soldiers on one side of that conflict actually did fight for freedom. Didn't start out that way. It initially started as a war, on the Union side anyway, to keep the Confederate states, the states that wanted to succeed and continue and make sure they could preserve their right to enslave African Americans. It was a war to keep them in as part of the Union. Eventually, however, over a period of time, it turned into a war to, as one of the outcomes, certainly, and one of the reasons for some group of people was to free the slaves. So, okay, Civil War, we can definitely say, there was a war in which some Americans fought to not only defend freedom, but to obtain freedom from people to which it was denied. But meanwhile, at the same time, we're still fighting against the Native Americans in the West to steal their land and so forth. And those wars continued up until the late 1880s. And I don't think you can say that our soldiers, the military, was fighting to defend anybody's freedom at all. Then, what? The war of the Spanish-American War, right? That was a war to defend our freedoms? Anybody who believes that has been smoking something, let me tell you. That was a war that was trumped up. I keep using the word trumped up, but it seems appropriate. That was a war that was trumped up by people in the media and others who wanted to have America become an imperial power. And essentially what we did in that war is we, claiming that we were supporting, the freedom of the Cuban rebels, we, declare and claiming we were, and this false flag attack against the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, we used that as a justification to go to war with Spain and steal their colonies, both here in the Caribbean and in the Philippines. That's right. That's how we ended up with Guam and Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. All these places that had originally been Spanish colonies, and we basically turned Cuba into a client state. So, no, we didn't fight that war to defend anybody's freedom at all, not one bit. Okay, World War One, was that fought to defend our freedom, defend the freedom of Americans? No, no, it was not. That was a European war, primarily a war between European empires that Wilson got us involved in. Not on the basis of anything that was going to help protect America. We were not under attack. Some of our individuals had died on cruise ships that had been torpedoed by the Germans, but there was no official attack by the powers that were aligned with Germany to make us enter that war. We did not fight that war to defend the freedom of any Americans. We might have fought the war to protect the interests of the British and the French, but we didn't really fight it. Let's face it. I don't think American freedom got advanced one little bit by the fact that we fought in World War One. And then we were involved in the Russian Civil War. Believe it or not, yes, American troops fought in what is now the former Soviet Union, right after the Russian Revolution. We had troops there supporting the Tsarist supporters, the White Russians, against the Red Army. Was that to protect our freedoms? Well, I suppose if you want to really try to get real abstract and esoteric, you could claim that the mere threat of communism in a backwards state like Russia at that time was a threat to our freedoms, but that seems a little whacked. I mean, no, we weren't fighting. We weren't involved in that civil war between the Red Army and the White Army in Russia to protect Americans or defend our freedoms. So, what's next? Well, I mean, there were a number of wars or conflicts we were engaged in Central America. None of those were fought to defend our freedoms. They might have been fought for the interests of corporate interests, but as Smedley Butler said, General Smedley Butler, who was a Marine general, who was fought many of those wars. War is a racket. Our soldiers were not being, the Marines, whatever, were not being deployed to defend any rights of any Americans. They were being fought to advance the interests of corporations and businesses that were in those countries. All right, so now let's go to the big one, World War II. All right. Was that a war to defend our freedoms? Well, we were attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. I'm not going to go into all the details, but there was a series of things that led up to that. Certainly, the Japanese were bad actors. The militaristic government of Japan was a very bad actor at that point in time. But we did not feel it important enough to go to war against Japan for what they were, atrocities they were committing in China or Manchuria or any place else until they actually attacked Pearl Harbor. In fact, there was a large number of Americans who did not want to get involved in any wars at that time, including the war by the Axis powers or mostly I should say Germany, against the rest of Europe. So why did we get involved in that war? Well, Roosevelt considered the Nazis a threat, and to all, I think it's true that the Nazis were a threat to a lot of things. Certainly, if they'd acquired nuclear weapons with their missile capabilities, and if they, but they might have lost that war. We don't know. We don't know what our involvement in that war ultimately, whether it actually changed things to a significant degree. Certainly, we, restored the freedoms of various countries that had been invaded by the Nazis. And I certainly don't stand, I don't disagree the Nazis were an incredibly evil force that needed to be defeated. But we were fighting against a very evil force that was slaughtering people. There's no other way to put it. Slaughtering people simply because of their their nationality, their ethnicity, or their religion, or the fact that they were disabled, or the fact that they were gay. So, yes, that was a great evil. You could argue that it was an existential threat to the freedom of the United States. I'll give you that one. But what about our wars post-World War II? Korea. Well, that was a war to prevent a communist takeover of South Korea. We didn't like, this communist ruler in North Korea who wanted to come down and take it all. That was more a Cold War thing, Cold War conflict. It was not done to protect any of our freedoms at all. It was done to protect, I guess, essentially our position in the Pacific, to protect Japan. It was the middle of the Red Scare, McCarthyism. Communism was evil, so we were fighting communism. So anytime you're fighting communism, you're automatically defending the freedom of Americans, even if they were not directly attacking us. So we get to the Vietnam War. And that's a war that there was no reason for us to fight. The Vietnamese had thrown out the French, who had used Vietnam as a colony, and we got involved in that war for reasons that are inexplicable to me, other than our military wanted to have justification to continue to fight around the globe. We were still concerned about this great fear of communism, atheism being advanced. I mean, but the truth be told, it was probably more fought just so our military could have a justification for lots and lots of toys, and the military-industrial complex made a lot of money out of that. A lot of generals got promoted, and a lot of young men who didn't want to go, many of them, were drafted. A lot of poor and lower middle class young men who couldn't get the draft exemptions that wealthier young Americans could get back in that time. I remember very well. People got exemptions from having to fight Vietnam, like Rush Limbaugh, for example, or our current president, or President Clinton. Yeah, there are a lot of people that managed to somehow avoid that war who were wealthy. Very few exceptions. John Kerry is about the only guy I can think of that was a somewhat wealthy Ivy League type that upper class, more of an upper class guy that went and fought in that war. But after that war, after his service there, he came out against it. He was an anti-war activist. And it was, in fact, the Vietnam War, which did little to defend the freedom of any American, and actually did a lot to take away our freedoms. as anybody who lived through that era knows. We went through periods where protesters were fired on by the National Guard and killed. The Chicago police went in and violated the rights of protesters in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention. There many examples. Marches on Washington in which Nixon released the police to do whatever the hell they wanted to the protesters. So I don't see those, the Vietnam War as being particularly helpful. And in fact, the effect of the Vietnam War afterwards was to ensure that the government decided we were no longer going to have a draft army. If we could avoid it, we went to an all-volunteer armed forces for the sole reason that we wanted to eliminate any kind of anti-war sentiment for future wars. Because let's face it, people were against the war in Vietnam for one good reason. A lot of them didn't want to go fight it. As Muhammad Ali famously said, "I got no gripe with the Viet Cong." And the Viet Cong certainly weren't a threat. Or the North Vietnamese certainly weren't a threat by any stretch of the imagination to the United States. During the same time, we're funding, of course, all sorts of little proxy wars. We're overthrowing legitimate governments in Iran and Chile and around the globe, Indonesia, to put in our own sort of dictators. So we weren't exactly defending our freedoms in those either. And then you get to, I guess, I'm going to skip Grenada and Panama and all that crap and go straight to the first Gulf War. Now, what was that about? It was about oil, right? It was about protecting and defending Kuwait and the Saudis from Saddam Hussein, who had also been an ally of ours, but who'd gotten the wrong idea that we would let him, invade Kuwait. Were we there to defend our freedoms? Hell no. We were there to defend the interests of the Saudis. Probably to a certain extent the interests of Israel and the interests of oil companies. Anyone who fought in the Gulf War suffered horribly, but they weren't suffering because they were fighting to defend the freedoms of Americans at home. That simply wasn't the case. And then we come to our post 9/11 wars. And I can't think of any, much as I respect people who serve in the military, they're pawns. They're being used as pawns in wars in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, now Syria, Libya, Yemen, wherever else we're employing our special operations troops. They're being deployed as pawns for the benefit not of ordinary Americans and our freedoms, but for the benefit of some really awful regimes with which we happen to have a mutual interest in maintaining, their ability to pump oil out of the ground and our ability to profit off that, our oil company's interest, right? Ability to profit off the oil business. And the Saudi regime is the largest supporter of terrorists in the world, and yet they're our ally. We funded terrorist organizations to fight against Syria. We're threatening wars against, possible, we've threatened war against Iran, who has never, done anything to threaten us with any kind of, to steal our freedoms away. I mean, I hear this bullshit about Sharia law being imposed. It's bullshit, guys. You all know that. So we look back over the history of our country and our nation and the wars we've been involved in, and with very few exceptions, they were not fought. And our soldiers did not die or were wounded defending our freedom, defending the freedoms that are set forth in the Bill of Rights. No, the fights that have been done to defend our freedoms have been done at home by some very courageous people, such as people involved in the civil rights movement, who suffered brutality, suffered imprisonment, were killed. And I'm not just talking about Martin Luther King, but numerous, individuals who were there working, to try to provide and extend more freedoms that were supposed to already have been granted to African Americans in the South and in the North as well. And we're still struggling, but it's not our soldiers that are making those fights for our freedoms. Okay? It's lawyers, it's movements, it's protesters. Much like the protesters that have taken a knee or refused to stand for the national anthem at sporting events. Now, maybe those people aren't, doing much beyond that, but they are at least bringing attention to the fact that we are a country that is not living up to its ideals, that is not extending freedom fully to everyone, that is not providing justice fully to everyone. A country where there's massive inequality, a country where we imprison more people than any other nation on earth, and that's more people than China, more people than some of the most horrific regimes that exist. That's right. We are essentially the largest prison nation in the world. I mean, now you could essentially call the American prison system a gulag at this point. We've thrown so many people in, basically, and primarily to fight this quote-unquote war on drugs. Did that protect anybody's freedoms? Hell no. Did everything we've done after 9/11, was that to protect any freedoms? Well, you tell me. They passed laws to allow the government to do increased surveillance of you and I and everybody else. We've seen our free speech rights shrink and shrink and shrink more until we're only entitled to have free speech in very small, limited areas, maybe. And if we get outside of those areas, we'll get arrested and beaten and brutalized as the people in the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and any other movement that has worked to try to extend freedom and liberty and justice has we've seen what's happened. So I have all the respect in the world for people that serve the country, because we do need a military. The world's a dangerous place. There are places where the lives of American citizens could be at risk. But in general, we're not asking those members of our armed forces to actually defend the lives of people and the freedoms of Americans. We're not asking, they're not defending us against, crazy threats, of invasion or military occupation, or, anything like that. No, our soldiers and sailors and Marines and everybody else generally, unfortunately and sadly, have been used by politicians and our government to protect the interests, powerful interests of large corporations and the large and secretive bureaucracies. Here I'm speaking about the intelligence community of the United States, CIA, NSA, DNI, FBI, all the other little, alphabet soup agencies that, quote, are considered part of the intelligence community. So, why should we sit there and demand people stand and support a flag because our military, first of all, that's absurd that we have to have there's this idea that we're not free to not stand or not support or not, do whatever the hell we want when somebody wants to raise a flag and wave it around or sing, the Star Spangled Banner. And in fact, if you go to any sporting event where they do this, you'll often see lots of people in the stands sitting down or going to the bathroom, or they don't give a shit. They haven't given a shit until those NFL players, till Colin Kaepernick took a stand and said he was doing it because of, racial injustice. And I support him and honor him for that. That's one of the most patriotic things you can do, is dissent. Standing up and saluting the flag and just saying, my country, right or wrong, love it or leave it. That doesn't bring freedom to anybody, folks. That steals freedom. That steals liberty. That imposes injustice. That defends the status quo and protects the interests of those who benefit from the status quo. The wealthy, the large multinational corporations, the people that have an interest in maintaining a large military and selling, hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons, planes, guns, whatever, bombs. We're defending the interests of those people when we go to war, and the interests of companies that, in the far off countries where we're going to, where they're doing business there, such as ExxonMobil. God, we got to protect ExxonMobil. God knows why, but we sure as hell do. God, we got to protect those Saudis. Hey, they may be the most despotic regime in the entire world, the most cruel regime. They may be the biggest promoter of terrorism. But God, we got to go protect their rights. Got to defend them from whatever. So with that, that's what I just want you to leave you with. We don't fight wars very often to defend our freedoms. And anybody that tells you anything different is a lying fuckwad. Okay? And that includes our current occupant of the Oval Office and many of the former occupants of the Oval Office. Far too many. Most of our politicians in Congress. No. So I'm sorry. I'm not going to sit there and say we should all stand and salute or hold our hands over our heart or sing the national anthem, because if we're not truly Americans. If we're not, we're just respecting the flag, whatever the fuck the flag is. We're not respecting our military. Well, our military, you know what a better way to respect them would be? Give them good health service, better health service than they have now. Don't keep underfunding the Veterans Administration. You want to look out for the rights of our military? You know, don't send them to wars where they're risking their lives for corporate interests. Okay? That's how you respect our military and the people who serve. So, with that said, I'm going to sign off. I'm going to hope that some of you learned something if you watched this. Maybe some of you did. I certainly hope so. Stephen D. Take care, everybody. See you when I see you.